Welcome back to Curious Christianity. Today I am answering some questions and objections to some of the content that I've posted about women and men in leadership positions in the church. And so I would like to get the chance to kind of respond to some of the things that some people have posted. And so shout out to King of Hogwarts. Thanks for all the comments and appreciate all the feedback. And so let's get started. So the first thing that I want to say is that by and large, I'm supporting what is known as complementarianism usually. And this has to do with the idea that men and women are created differently and that they both have different roles that are partially inherent to their gender. In other words, because they were created males and females, there are certain roles that God designed for men and women to take place in general. I believe that the primary two areas in the Bible that it talks about these roles taking, being of significance is number one, in the home. And it's the idea that the husbands are to generally have the leadership role in the home. And the wives are to play the complementary role, and they're kind of to help support the husband and submit to him. Number two is church leadership and authority. That the primary leadership roles in the church for authority, guidance, direction is generally set for the men. Now, what am I not saying? I am not saying that I don't think that women should be involved in ministry. I think that women should be involved in ministry and that they should play important roles in the church. I am mainly saying we're talking about the head roles inside of the church, and then, of course, the home has to do with husbands and wives. So I don't think that there should be blanket statements about the idea that women can't do anything in ministry, that they can't share the gospel or anything else. I even had responses on Twitter when talking about this issue of men and women in the church, and I asked about, okay, well, what would be like the best versions as to why women should be allowed to, have the chief roles in the church, be pastors or elders or deacons. And the primary verse that I got in response for the big egalitarian verse supporting equality amongst authority was John 3:16. I found that to be kind of ironic, and John 3:16 is just this idea that Christ died for everyone. And I get it. I fully agree. Christ died for everyone, and he loves everyone on the earth. But that doesn't mean that everybody is meant to be in leadership positions. Even talking about just overseers and pastors, not all men are called to be overseers and pastors. Period. That's just not for everyone. So the idea that everyone should be completely equal when it comes to authority, I just don't see that in the Bible. And I think there are several verses that are absolutely putting men in positions of authority. And I think it's important to recognize what it is we're trying to say and how we're trying to differentiate these things. So, with that being said, let's get into a couple of these objections and kind of the major thing. All right, so number one, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I'm going to go ahead and quote a couple of comments. And this idea is love means letting them play. The difference between, letting them play and not letting them play. If we're truly loving everyone, then shouldn't men and women have exactly the same opportunities to lead, as opposed to simply, okay, only men can have these positions and women can't. So number one, no, I do not think that this is completely loving. It's not loving necessarily to just allow women to take leadership positions if that is not what God has intended for them. So let me give you the example that was kind of set up here. It says, all right, there are different leagues and different teams for different age groups and different genders. If you aren't physically able to play as good as varsity, there are intramural and recreational leagues, there are AAA and AA leagues, there are minor leagues, munchkin leagues. But for complementarians, there is only one league, and it's the woman who can't be pastors, end of story. And this is one of the arguments they kind of brought up against. It's the idea that it's like, it doesn't really seem fair. It doesn't really seem loving and caring on the complementarian side because they won't allow the women into the league, so to speak. Now, to me, I actually find this to be the opposite, because in egalitarians, like for the side that believes that there should be no boundaries whatsoever concerning authority, there's only one league. There are no other leagues. It's only to me in this side who believes in male headship and male authority and men having certain roles that are different from women that there are different leagues at all. We would say is like, no, look, there are leagues for ministry. There are roles for ministry. There is evangelism and there is types of teaching out there. And there are things that women should be actively involved in. They should be actively serving in the church, actively participating in evangelizing your neighbors and taking care of other people and being ministers of the gospel around the world. We're just saying, like, guess what? There are some leagues, though, that are not designed or meant for them. And I think it's ironic in today's world where we're kind of talking about the differences between men and women in this whole trans debate and trans issues of the different leagues. Can we have, trans women, trans men competing in the other leagues? Can we have a mixing of the leagues? And it seems really evident that there is a big disparity between men and women in these sports leagues. And I don't think that it's loving to allow women to compete or to be in these leagues with certain men where they will almost certainly get hurt. Now, I know the argument may be, it's like, well, look, that's physically, and there's a significant difference between physically and fill in the blank, all the other stuff, mentally or emotionally or leadership. Now, again, I think it's really important. We try and discern and find out what is it that God has created us for, and if there are any differences between the roles. And I think it seems really evident to me that, look, men and women are not the same, and God has created certain roles around that. Now, I know I haven't given all the scripture verses for this just yet, but we'll get going, and I'll bring up some other examples as we go. So I think that, the way that God has organized things and the way that I read the Bible, I wish that I had some better verses. What verses is the other side arguing for that says men and women should both have authority equally and across the board? Because I don't see that. And I do see these verses, for Paul arguing for male leadership, and constantly talking about this idea of like, hey, men should be the leaders in the home. Men should be the leaders in the church. And then going back to the Old Testament. So it's difficult for me to see how we need to make this leap towards the idea of men and women not having any differences in roles. There seemed to be a clear divide of differences in roles from the Old Testament all the way to the New Testament, and that never really changed. So I don't think that it's about love that you simply give someone positions in the church. Now, the King of Hogwarts, the YouTube handle, they also suggested this. They said, why couldn't loving your neighbor be related to who is allowed to hold positions in church? I love my neighbor and he's allowed to have a position on our baseball team. If someone was upset that they were never allowed to play left field, you can show them love by giving them that opportunity. Okay. I do not believe that it's loving simply to give people positions, especially when we're not talking about recreational baseball. Okay. We're talking about real life. We're talking about the real world, and we're talking about really important positions. We're talking about church leadership. And this is one of the most important things that Christ has ordained and given us on earth is the church. The church is people to push the gospel forward in the world. So this is a matter of life and death. Like when we talk about the military, everyone recognizes or should recognize that the military is about life and death. The decisions you make there matter. The decisions that you make in church leadership and how the church is to operate is a matter of life and death. It is not just a game. And just because women might have been excluded and they might want certain positions of leadership and authority, that doesn't seem to hold any bearing on if they should have it. I feel like there has to be a good biblical precedent to say that women can step into these positions of authority, and it needs to be solid. And I think that just deciding like, well, we can just give it to them because it would be a nice thing to do is not a good enough reason in and of itself. I don't see love being a reason to elevate anyone into a position of authority. We're not talking about simply doing something kind or nice. We're talking about things that will have an impact on everyone else around them, and they'll have a significant impact in the church. So I think we need good biblical precedent to move forward with that. Yeah. So now, leadership is about gifts and abilities. This is something that I've heard from several people, and they argue that leadership is about gifts and abilities. Therefore, as long as a woman is gifted and has the ability to lead, she can speak well, she can articulate, she can get people to follow her, then therefore we should put her into that spot, right? We don't want to hold women back from achieving all that God has called them to do. I think it's really important to recognize that, again, I'm not saying that women should not be involved in ministry. I'm not saying that women should not be involved in preaching the gospel and spreading the word and in doing Christian ministry, right? So should a woman not be able to use her gifts? Not saying that at all. But should she be the senior leader in a church? That's where I disagree. I don't see that in the Bible, and I see good verses indicating this idea that, yes, women are not meant to hold the senior roles in leadership. So one can rationalize that, okay, well, it seems like it only makes sense. It only makes sense that if you have the abilities to do something, that therefore you should lead. I think this is a very strange argument because it leads to the idea that might is right. Like, the church is not a wolf pack. Whoever is the strongest then takes down the other leader and ascends to being the new pack leader because they were able to know more scripture. They were able to preach better or to teach better, or they had more character. And therefore, they're the ones who need to be elevated into the positions of authority. Like, Christianity is not organized simply on who has the most intelligence, who has the most ability, or any of those sorts of things. It's orchestrated around order. And God did not tell us to move people into positions of power based on their perceived abilities and talents. It's not simply enough to say that I'm talented, therefore I deserve this position of authority. Just imagine the military. For those that have been in the military or are in the military, you understand that your commanding officers, those who are in authority over you, they are not necessarily the person who is the wisest, smartest, most intelligent, physically strongest, most capable people. But that doesn't mean that they aren't the ones who hold the authority. You might wish they were stronger. You might wish they were smarter. You might wish they were nicer. That does not change the fact of who has the authority and who should give the orders. It is the person above, the person with the authority, that has the responsibility to make the decisions moving forward. And it's not based upon their abilities. And if another soldier beneath them has more ability, more talent, more intelligence, more information, more experience, it still does not change the rank and order of those positions. And that doesn't make the soldiers beneath them any less human. And it doesn't make them any less of a soldier. They do have a lower position concerning authority. And look, it's a wise commander who asks for the advice and counsel of the junior officer who may know more about the situation than they do. It's very possible that the other ones in the position on the ground have more information, have more knowledge. And so therefore it's a good idea to ask, like, hey, look, what do you think we should do in this situation? But that doesn't change the order of events. It doesn't change who's in charge, who's responsible, and where the buck ultimately stops. That junior officer, yeah, they might buck the system. They might go back and say, hey, I don't think we should do this. This is a terrible idea. And good for them. But at the end of the day, it comes down to that commanding officer's choices. Now, for the other big one. Okay, let me read a couple portions here. And this is the idea about patriarchy. So the King of Hogwarts says this, right? But what is the church doing stuck in patriarchal culture of 100 AD? So, and then a couple other things here, right? So when you talk about patriarchal culture, I think it's important, number one, to start to try and get into, okay, are we already assuming that the patriarchy or a patriarchal culture is a negative thing? Is that where you start from? Or do we start somewhere else? If you start with the idea that all patriarchies are bad and negative, I totally get how you get to this question. However, I don't think that a patriarchal culture is in and of itself inherently bad or negative. But this goes back to something else. It goes back to culture. Okay, back during the times when Paul's writing his letters, what about the culture was good, right, and should stay as it is today? What about it was simply a cultural issue and is not meant to be understood biblically? And the example that was given as well is slavery, right? They're talking about slavery and submission and all of these other issues. So if we don't accept slavery, then why are we accepting the idea of women submitting to their husbands? Isn't that an outdated idea that is just as wrong as slavery itself? I don't think the two are equivalent. And I don't think the Bible speaks nearly as clearly about the issue of slavery in the sense of asking, like, okay, well, is it promoting slavery? I don't think that it's promoting slavery. And I don't think that when it says slavery, that it's talking about the same picture that most of us have today. But let's address a little bit more of this issue between the two. What about a patriarchal culture? And that part of culture is supposed to be with us today in the church. And what a part some of those things should be outdated and not be a part of the church today. So almost universally, I don't know anybody who's advocating for slavery in the church today. And I do not see the Bible in those early chapters and those chapters of the New Testament that Paul's writing advocating for slavery. The main thing that I do see Paul advocating for is submission. I think that when you read Peter, 1 Peter 3, when you read Paul in 1 Timothy, really when you just read Paul in general on this subject, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, talking about submission to authority, that the primary point is that he is advocating for submission to authority is a positive thing. And so, like, to give you an example, right? So 1 Peter 3, 1 through 6, it says this: in the same way, You wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, as they observe your pure conduct with fear. Your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on garments, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible quality of a lowly and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being subject to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. You have become her children if you do good, not fearing any intimidation. I think that Peter is celebrating submission to authority. And so I think that that's the primary focus that we should take away, even when Paul is saying, hey, slaves, you should submit to your masters. In all of these spaces, I think is absolutely celebrating the idea of submission, and that is absolutely beyond culture. It is completely transcultural to say that, submission to authority is a good thing. Now we can talk about, the other issues. Well, what happens if authority goes completely off the rails and they don't want to worship God, or they want you to do ungodly? That's a completely different subject. But when somebody is asking something rightly of you and you are under authority, submission to them is the right way to go. So the real question is, should we think that there is any differentiation in authority based on gender? And I think that the answer is yes. There are a lot of verses in here that we could consider, but I think even just looking at 1 Peter 1-6, right? And he's talking about this idea of these holy, godly women who hoped in God and who adorned themselves, and them being subject to their own husbands. Peter is assuming that the husband is the authority over the wife. And he's not saying anything against it, but rather he's celebrating it. And this, I think, is extremely evident that if we want to talk about patriarchy being a negative aspect of culture, we do also need to ask, where did this aspect of culture come from? Is there any way that this part of culture could be biblical in any sense? And so I see this as being very much part of the Judeo-Christian culture. I think it's part of the culture going all the way back to Adam and Eve in the garden. So when you see Adam and Eve, God makes a covenant with Adam concerning the tree of life, right? When he gives Adam the command, do not eat from the tree of life, he doesn't wait for Eve to be born. And so I think right in the beginning, you see this idea of Adam being the federal head. And this is actually why you see the talk about in Romans, for in Adam we all died, because he was the one who represented mankind. And then again, you continue to see the headship going from Adam to Abraham. We're all children of Abraham. But we don't ever see God grounding his promises and putting all of the burden responsibilities on a woman in the Old Testament. And not only that, look, when you see God bringing together the whole nation of Israel, the one thing that he could have done, remember he's creating an entire nation, was he could have set up men and women to co-lead together. But even in the beginning conception of Israel, we see men to be the patriarchs. When we see the temple system bring about, he doesn't allow women to be the Levites to go and administer all of the priestly duties. We don't see women being put in charge of the military and the army. We don't see women being the primary leaders of Israel. And I think that's really significant, because then once you move over into the New Testament, again, everything has been extremely consistent from Genesis all the way to the New Testament that men were the ones who were in authority, both in their homes and in the leadership roles concerning religious activities. And this hasn't changed in the New Testament. I think the burden of proof is on the one who wants to espouse that there should be complete equality in the New Testament, and that I think they need to show why the New Testament is saying something completely different from the entire Old Testament and why things are supposed to have changed. Because it seems very much like when Paul is spouting off all of these things concerning wives submitting to their husbands, that the whole culture, as most of them have said, that was a patriarchal culture, they would have understood very clearly what it means for a wife to submit to her husband, what it means for the church to have male leadership and male headship. There wouldn't be any major reason to suspect that they think that Paul is saying something completely different and foreign from everything that they've heard in the past. There needs to be some strong verses or indicators in the New Testament that are saying women should have the same authority roles as the men. And my struggle is, I don't see it. I don't see it. I'm very open to talking about this subject, and if other people want to continue to discuss it, I'm very happy to discuss it. But I'm looking for some evidence, because I feel like not only do you need to begin to tear down all of the verses that are saying men are the head, men are to be in authority, men are in all of these positions of authority, then you need to bring about your own case that says, and women should also be able to occupy all of these places. Now, can you talk about exceptions? Sure. But exceptions prove the rule. They don't give you an entire new system. I think about when Jesus says, hey, look, Moses gave them a certificate of divorce, right? He gives this as this exception. He said, but from the beginning, it was never meant to be that way, right? In other words, he was like, man and woman should get together and stay married for the rest of their life. But you know what? God was like, but for the hardness of their hearts, he permitted them to divorce. Now, does that mean people should divorce? No, they shouldn't divorce. But sometimes it happens. And so it's possible. Is it possible that you could have a female leader in some rare, bizarre scenarios? Sure. Like, and you can talk about like, oh, there are churches overseas that have a female leader because there were no men to lead. Okay. Yeah. But we're not talking about that here. We're talking about what direction should the church be headed? What direction should they be encouraging men and women towards? Should they be encouraging women? Women should take the head leadership positions. Women should be the ones to take all of the major positions in the church. And men should be the ones who stay home. I'm going to make one other argument and go out on a limb here for 2 seconds. For all of the women who are out there, I just want to know, how okay would you be if all of the women had all of the positions of authority and the men just stayed home to take care of the house? The men just stayed home to watch over the kids, read their Bibles at home, and not be the public speakers and leaders in the world. Is that the world that you want and are looking for? For a lot of the women I know, probably not. But what is it that you do want, and what is it you think the Bible is saying when it comes to this issue? All right. Leave your comments in the discussion below, and look forward to the next video.